One of the areas that A-level students find most challenging is this idea of consistently applying a criteria, which is referenced in the mark scheme. So this video will just talk you through what we mean by consistently applying a criteria. And this refers to all AO1 essay questions, whether it's on the Britain, the warfare, or the America paper. So we're going to use this as an example. The only protest movement to have any success between 1964 and 1972 was the women's liberation movement. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Now they've given you the focus of this question, the women's liberation movement. So you know that now needs to go into paragraph 1. So always try to make the focus of the question paragraph 1. What I suggest you do now is just pause the video and have a think about 2 other protest groups that you might want to compare against the women's liberation movement. So using the dates particularly, I can't really use the civil rights movement because that's more relevant to the period before 1964, thinking about the Civil Rights Act being passed in 1964. So there are quite a few that you could choose from. You could choose the New Left and the student movement. You could pick the Black Panthers, Black Power, gay rights. The 2 I've chosen to use are the Black Panthers, and thirdly, the gay rights movement. So those are my 3 paragraphs. But also, I need to deal with this keyword success, and that's where I'm going to apply my criteria to. How am I actually evaluating success? What does success look like? So again, pause the video, have a think about 3 different ways that you could actually define and evaluate. You could do it short term, long term, but that's quite generalized. So in this instance, I've decided to apply legislative change, or you could think of achieving their goals. Secondly, how many participants they had, because if they had a large number of participants, that would indicate some success. And thirdly, did they raise awareness or change attitudes at all? What I've done is I've put it into a chart here. I'm just going to do a tick or a cross exercise. I've put my protest groups down the left hand side. Again, pause the video and just do a think about those 3 protest groups. Use your notes if you need to, and just do a tick or cross whether you think they achieved those objectives. So thinking about the women's liberation movement, did they achieve their goals? Well, partly. You'd have to acknowledge that the women's liberation movement is quite a big movement. We've got the mainstream movement, which is the National Organization of Women, and then we have the more radical element, the New York Radical Women or the Red Stockings. So there is a danger that you think of the women's liberation movement as one cohesive, organized group. They're not. Now do have some success. They get some employment discrimination legislation passed, but actually their main goal, which was the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have given women equal rights protected in the Constitution, that has not been a success. So I've kind of given it a small tick for that. They've achieved some of their goals, but ultimately they didn't achieve the ultimate goal that they wanted. I've given them a big tick for number of participants. Really, before the women's liberation movement, there was the society really pushed women to conforming into a mould of the 1950s. So it wasn't really until the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique that women started to really come together. And of course, women make up 50% of the population. So yes, they do have large numbers of participants. I've given them a big tick for raising awareness and changing attitudes. They promoted an alternative view of women and the expectation of women. So, you know, you might want to draw in some of the arguments about second wave feminism here, that now they'd achieved the vote and the right to vote in the first wave of feminism. Second wave was very much about questioning what it means to be a woman in American society. So they are reasonably successful at doing that. They had meetings, particularly the radical women, they had meetings about raising consciousness and talking about their experiences as a female in society. So if we go on to the second one, the Black Panthers, did they achieve their goals? Well, no, they didn't. And we'll come on to that in a moment. Their 10-point program was far too revolutionary to really achieve those goals. They were quite limited in terms of their membership, but you could say actually they do have some success in raising awareness about certain issues that were affecting African Americans in the 1960s. Finally, gay rights. Do they achieve their goals? Well, it's very hard to actually pinpoint what their goals were, other than to eliminate the amount of discrimination that they faced. They didn't have any specific goals, as it were, as an organisation. It was very difficult, apart from in New York, San Francisco, it's very difficult for gay men and women to come out in the 1960s still. So no, there aren't that many participants. It's very geographically limited. Finally, did they change awareness or change attitudes or raise awareness? The barrier, I would say that the social barriers to coming out to being gay in the 1960s are still there at the end of the decade and still there through the 1970s. So I wouldn't say they have very much success there. So if we look at this overview of our chart and think back to the question, well, you could say yes, the women's liberation of R3 is the only one that really has very much success. So what I've done here is I've put it into, I've focused in on the Black Panthers paragraph. So stop the video and just have a quick read through and think about how I've applied criteria to this paragraph. So I've opened it with a really strong judgment. The Black Panthers had minimal success as a protest movement, so I'm really focused on the question. I haven't started in 1966, which would be a narrative opening. And I've given a reason for that judgment. They're too radical. They're ultimately undermined by the federal government. You can see in the yellow, I've gone with this is their first criteria, achieving their goals. They laid out point program and which included end of capitalism, advocated black separatism. Therefore, they failed in their objectives. So I've got a clear judgment about that criteria. They did have some legislative success in applying pressure for greater funding for sickle cell disease. So I've got some balance in there too. Then I go on to my second criteria, which is the number of participants. It's quite minimal, there's only 2,000, but there are chapters across the country. But I have balanced it out by saying, despite having few numbers, they did offer a message more relevant to working class areas. So perhaps their participation numbers were concentrated in certain areas like Watts. And finally, as my third criteria, did they raise awareness, change attitudes? Well, one of their issues, primary objectives, was about raising awareness of police brutality. And they did have some success with that, with their Patrol the Pigs campaign. And then finally, I have got, I've kind of linked it back here to the women's liberation movement. The Panthers, they're too revolutionary in their goal. So in comparison to the women's liberation movement, no, they don't have very much success.